I forgot to mention, probably because I just don't know, obviously something's happening up here with the food drive or something with the food pantry. And does anybody know what's happening here, for how long? Tammy? Pardon? It's in my mailbox. If anyone would like to know what's happening here, go back and get the thing out of my mailbox and read it. But my guess is food pantry, Roanoke Food Pantry. Okay. So to bring anything for there, or are we focusing on paper or anything? Or it's in my mailbox. Okay. All right. Read whatever's in my mailbox, and let's just bring a bunch of stuff for the food pantry. Sorry about that. I need help. Boy, I'm looking forward to getting back to some regular things. I was talking to Carl on the way over here that, it's been about a year ago, maybe just a couple more weeks that, some of this stuff started hitting, and it was one of the first video services we did, and in there I remember saying, well, we're going to have an Easter service. We're going to do our best to have an Easter service. This was 2020, and I was pretty sure, coming up in April, things will be back to normal, and we're going to have a regular Easter service. And here we are, 12 months later, and I'm still having this question. I wonder if we're going to have a regular Easter service even this year. But no doubt we will have an Easter service here of some kind. But boy, I'm just ready to get back to some Easter breakfast and bacon and all those things that we smell, and it's coming. It's going to happen. We are on this kind of trek of quickly and from a very high altitude looking at the Old Testament. And we're looking at some of the key stories within the Old Testament just to review this great and awesome plan of God. And this kind of kicked off after our Christmas celebration, that, this wonderful event that Christ came in flesh for us, for the salvation of all the world. And the obvious question, well, gosh, where were we? Why were people in this state where we needed Messiah and we needed Savior to come and we needed Christmas to happen? And so we thought, just to help us understand this great grand story that you and I are part of, well, we're making this sweeping pass over all of the New Testament in 10 or 12 weeks here that we're going to look at. A lot of text to cover, but we're trying to look at some of these familiar stories and try to get our minds wrapped around a little bit this awesome move of God, that He would do what He did for us, that He would, out of His sheer love for humankind, do what He would do to bring us back to Him. And that's this big story. That's this overarching story that starts in Genesis 1 and took a key and pivotal point when Christ came, but the story goes on and continues in my life and in your life in 2021. So we've covered creation. We've covered the call of Abraham as God's people to be this nation that would come and do what God is going to do through this people. And the nation of Israel has grown and developed. And last week we were at a point where we talked about Moses and the deliverance of these people out of the slavery that Egypt and Pharaoh had over all that nation. And so they have left. They have exited Egypt, and they are on their way to this land that God has promised them. And that's where we catch up with the story today. And the story is about Joshua, a familiar story about Joshua as he takes the torch from Moses and leaves his people. He leads this group of people to do and to be the people that God's called them to be so long ago. So I pick up on the story in Joshua chapter 3. And it says there in verse 7, the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you, Joshua, in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that I will be with you as I was with Moses. And so then Joshua now is the leader of all Israel, and he goes back to the people and proclaims to them, by this you shall know that among you is the living God, who without fail will drive out from before you all of the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. And he finished by saying, "Aight." Thanks. A lot of ites. So this campaign begins. They're at the the break of the promised land. They're at the River Jordan. And Joshua's going to take the leadership passed to him from Moses to do what God said he's going to do. We're going to take you into this awesome land, this land flowing with milk and honey, and you're going to be in this land to do and to be the people I've called you to be. And there's a lot of military action in this section. And if you're following along, which I'm hoping some of you are, that we have these passages kind of segregated out where you can follow along with some of these, either listening to on your tablet or reading. But an awful lot of warfare, awful lot of battle, and it continues from this point up even to when King David actually takes over the city of Jerusalem and sets up. This is going to be the center. This is going to be where Israel's going to have its center of worship and its center of leadership and its center of all social actions. So they send these spies into the land. They send spies into this promised land. Some of them go in there to check it out and see what's there. What is it we're gonna face? And the enemies, the people of the time, kind of hear of these people there, and so Rahab, who is a prostitute in Jericho, she takes these spies and hides them, and she takes care of them so that they're not going to be killed by the people of the town of Jericho where they're at. And so the spies go back and they report to all the people about the land that's there. And Joshua then instructs the army to do some kind of a strange thing. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take the Ark of the Covenant. And we didn't talk about that, but remember Moses came down from Sinai with all that law, and so they put the law in this carefully crafted box they called the Ark of the Covenant that was made out of gold and had certain poles that were on it. They carried this around, and this was the evidence of the presence of the living God being with the people. And oftentimes that would lead their people out into battle. And so that's what Joshua instructs the people to do. Have your priests take that ark and walk around the town of Jericho. Parade around that town. Do this for 7 days. And they parade around all of this town. And on the seventh day, it says, do this. On that seventh day, blow all your horns and give a loud shout. And you know what happens if from Vacation Bible School when you're a kid, the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. And this begins then this quest for the land. And we read a little bit about this then taking of Jericho, which would have been one of the first military campaigns of Israel as they would move into this promised land. This comes from chapter 6 and starting in verse 20. And this is the point where the scripture tells us the people shouted and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised with a great shout and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house. That was Rahab. They had her house marked. Go in there and bring her out and all that belonged to her, as you swore to her. So the young men did that who had been spies. They went in. They brought Rahab out along with her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her. So what we have happening here is we see God's faithfulness fulfilling the plan that he said he was going to do. He is about bringing people back to himself. That's the overarching story that God is doing throughout all Scripture. He loves people so much that he wants to bring people back. And he started this plan out saying, this is what I'm going to do. I want to bring all people back to myself, and it's going to start with a people. And I'm going to grow this people. This nation is going to grow in a great nation for the purpose of bringing glory to me. And they found themselves, slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And God freed them just recently from the bondage that they had under Egypt. And he brought them out, and out of love, he said, here's how I want you to act. Here's my 10 commandments. Here's my code of ethics that I want you to live by as my people. Why? Because I want you to be a holy people. And I want you to be in right relationship with me. And this plan is being fulfilled. And he's bringing them to this land to continue this plan of being his people. Again, to bring glory to him. Remember, this goes clear back hundreds of years before, where God called Abraham out, said, "Hey, Abe, get up, leave your land, and go to the land I'm going to show you, because I want to make it great. And I want all nations to be blessed through you." And we know that, thousands of years later, that all nations, including you and I, are blessed through that covenant he made with Abraham, because Christ came from this people. Jesus came to you and I because of what had started with Abraham. And he told Abraham then, hundreds of years before where we're at with Joshua, "To your descendants, I'm going to give you this great land, this awesome land, this side of the Jordan that's just rich beyond belief. And this is where you're going to settle." They're given this land. And we see, Raleigh, go to the one that's got the map on it there, if you can. We see that what happens is eventually when this is all over with, God has given this land, and that's pretty much modern day Israel. That's where Israel currently is at right now. But the reason I show you that is Joshua began this campaign right here with this Battle of Jericho, where they blew the horns and shouted and the walls came down, and they took this town of Jericho. And in there, the colored sections, it's small, you can't read it very, very well. But each one of those sections represents a land given to one of those original tribes of Israel. They would have been Abraham's grandsons. You had Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob had those 12 sons. Had Joseph and not Manasseh, but had Gad and Asher and Dancer and Prancer and all those other 12 people that were part of the nations. And those 12 regions are the lands that each of those tribes settled eventually, down the road. This is going to take a while, but the campaign's starting now with Joshua. And that land then is going to be used where these people are there to do what it is that God called his people to do, to be my people, to witness to the rest of the world who God is. They are to showcase the God of all gods. Many gods in the region here, but God is using this nation of Israel, that he is the God of gods, the Lord of lords. Be my obedient people. Live an obedient lifestyle. Be a nation, Israel, that's holy to God. That's how he's working out this plan. Do you remember this song? Joshua fought the battle at Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Anybody? Joshua fought the battle at Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Thanks. I'm glad I was really worried that maybe you hadn't heard that, and I thought maybe I dreamed it up somewhere. Yeah, that was a children's song we sang, and it was fun, Fought the battle of Jericho, the walls come tumbling down. But you know what the song does not sing about? It doesn't sing about what happened after those walls came tumbling down. It doesn't sing about Israel going in and by the edge of the sword taking men, women, children, oxen, sheep, donkeys, anything that lived was taken by Israel, led by Joshua. That's not in the song. We don't sing about killing all those goats and the kids and the sheep and all that stuff. It's just kind of a cute song we sing about blowing trumpets and the walls come down. But that's in the story. That is part of the story, and it's kind of a difficult part of the story, and it causes us, I hope, to have some questions. That's a difficult part of the passage here, because as you read that whole passage, God calls for the complete annihilation of people. When those walls come down, you go in there and this is what you're to do. Anything that lives, you're to take it. It's very violent and it's very graphic. And this is how God is fulfilling this promise to take this land. It's not going to be a peaceful handover. Israel's not going to walk in and all those Jebusites, and they're not going to say, "Oh, here they come. Here's the deed to the land. It's yours. You can have it doesn't work that way. This part of the text, as we read through this story of Israel's conquest of the land, it's done not peacefully. It's done forcefully. And Israel comes to a people that occupies this land and militarily forces them out. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of destruction in this part of the story. Man, if you're like me, that's questions. That causes questions. Is Is this the same God that revealed himself in Jesus Christ? It seems to me there's a lot of brutality and cruelty in this. And how does that align with Jesus' teaching of love your enemies? Kind of hard to reconcile that a little bit. How is that? These are tough questions. And I think that as we find ourselves in this story, you've heard me say this a lot, this isn't a story we spectate, this is a story you and I participate in. We're going to have these difficult questions. And what is it that we're to do about these? What are we to do with these questions about, boy, that seems kind of tough about what God is doing here with what he's asking Joshua and all of Israel to do. Tough questions. I got a call this week, and they said on the phone, he was sharing with me about a friend, and this friend that he has kind of has some issues, coping, maybe some anxiety, some struggling issues. Young guy, 2 kids, and his wife just recently was in a car crash and was killed. And this guy's already got some issues on his own, and now stuff happens. And now this man who struggles with some coping things is now left without his wife and the mother of his children. And then the question that came up was this: how would God allow this? How does God allow this to happen? It's a great question, and we can fill in the blank with so many of our own stories, and come back to a difficult question like we're faced in this part of the text here. That's hard. How does he allow this to happen? How does God allow such evil? Let me frame a few more of these questions that maybe you've bumped up against. How is it that I prayed so hard for God to take this disease away from my child and he didn't? Yet down the road, so-and-so was healed. Why is that? How did God allow this to happen to me? Why is it that God allowed my loved one to be taken so early? Why does God allow my spouse to do the things that he does or she does? Where is God in the middle of all the stuff that seems to be going on right now in our country regarding a pandemic and regarding the social issues they have and the problems with government? Where is he in this land that he seems to have blessed through all these years? It's tough. These are tough questions, I believe. And again, I think if we are going to bring ourselves into this story and not just spectate away from the story, but we bring ourselves into the story, we're going to face these tough questions. These tough questions of life and where God is in all of this. How do we face a difficult question about what God is having Israel do initially as they move into this land? One of the ways we could deal with it, and I think a lot of people do, is just avoid it. You come to a difficult passage like we read in Joshua here where God says, go in and kill them all. Take them all. And there's other instances where this seems to be the will of God, and this is how he's fulfilling his plan. A lot of people, how they approach it is just avoid it. You don't want to have anything to do with that. It's hard. And so that's why a lot of people just take the Old Testament and go, we're not going to deal with that. I just want to start dealing with Matthew where it's, lovey and Jesus and, everything's all good. But I just don't think that's the right way to go, because this story is cover to cover and it reveals God's great and awesome plan that includes you and I. And what do you do when you come across these difficult questions in the Scripture, these difficult questions that are very hard for us to answer here? So I'll give a couple of feeble attempts at maybe providing some potential answers to this deal with Joshua to go into Jericho and take them all, children and animals. The first is a little bit of a cop-out. Well, God's God, and God can do what he wants to do, and whatever he wants to do is right because God is God. That's that's an easy cop-out, and really it's not, because at the heart of it, he can do that. Another possibility as I look at this and I think about where people would be, and if I was one of the Israelites at this time in history, perhaps Israel at that point needed to see this kind of domination, this demonstration of power. Because at this time, whoever God won the battle, that God was God. And that's what the culture at the time would have believed. And maybe because of where people were, God knew that this is what Israel was going to need to see. they're going to need to see as they take my word in front of them that I am all-powerful. Perhaps that was part of God's plan and why he was doing this. Perhaps God was judging the town of Jericho. Maybe he was using Israel at the time to execute his judgment because of who those people were. We know he's done this before. In the time of Noah, God was so fed up with humanity. He used rain and a lot of water to execute his judgment on those people. And he used fire later on to execute his judgment on a couple other towns that were just so morally corrupt. Sodom and Gomorrah, and he judged them then. Maybe that's what's happening here. The people of Jericho during Joshua's time need the nation of Israel to come and execute his judgment. We don't know. It's a possibility. There's an interesting passage in this I thought was interesting as they're preparing to go in this. This comes from Joshua 5. I don't have it on the screen there, but Joshua is preparing for this to happen, and he comes across the angel of the Lord who is in the form of a soldier. And Joshua asks this angel of God, "Are you one of us or one of our adversaries?" He says in reply, "Neither. But as the commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." And I thought that was interesting there, that, this was in the middle of what we see happening here. The angel of the Lord comes and he says, "Are you for us or are you against us, Joshua?" I said, Neither. But I have come. Meaning that he is fulfilling the part of God's plan here. And that kind of struck a chord with me, especially in the times that we live here that we're so divisive. Pick an issue. Republican, Democrat, within the church, progressive or liberal. And then God shows up and whatever side you're on, and he says, "Whose side you on?" And I think God would have a similar answer to how he answered Joshua here. Neither. I am on neither side. I'm here to fulfill God's plan, and I need to find myself aligned with that attitude more and more. And then, maybe something else, and this is sort of an answer that helps me through those other difficult questions that I have when tragedy strikes. That, perhaps we put such emphasis on our life and our health in this short amount of time that we have here in this human life from birth to death. We put so much emphasis on that perhaps what is at play here, what is at stake here, what really is going on is something so much larger and bigger than we can imagine. It took place in Jericho, and Joshua and his people. It seems brutal as we look at this here, but when you look at the grand scheme of all things, so much of life is like Little League. When you're in Little League and you're 9 years old and you got your bat and your mitt and you're riding your bike to practice, that's all there is. And even the way parents behave at Little League games, sometimes you think, it's incredible. Because you think all that really is in Little League is a Little League, and it's just, this is it. It's all, And then you get out of Little League and you realize there's more to life. And I think maybe that is so true in this life. The time of Jericho and the battle that Joshua fought in our own life, we need to look back and say, there's something much bigger, much more important, something more comprehensive than we can understand. And that helps me, I believe, with some of the more difficult things we go through. Yeah, those are feeble attempts to understand what God had Israel do to Jericho then, but I don't think we're ever going to fully explain that. I just don't think that it's going to happen. But he's going to do what he said he's going to do. He's going to build this people. You see his faithfulness throughout this story. Abraham, I'll make your people great. And here we're seeing that happen. This nation would grow, and they would do exactly what they were to do. They would reveal God, and that's what they did. And it's interesting, in part of this story, Rahab, the woman that was in Jericho at the time, who was a prostitute, was saved. She gets assimilated into Israel, and she would be an ancestor to Jesus Christ. His plan is fulfilled, and we can trust him. I think, though, for me, most of all, as I grapple with these difficult passages, is we need to consider the fact that we're really even asking the question. It's cool that we can even do that. And to me, that gets us positioned exactly where we ought to be. We're seeking, and we're without answers, and we want to know more. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to connect with God, our source. As we look back on this great story, we're seeking for answers. And listen here, questioning is good, and getting answers, it's growth, because we're getting knowledge, and that's good. But listen as well, questioning and not getting answers is growth too, because that's where our faith grows. We won't always have answers to these tough situations we're going to come across in the Bible. We're not going to have pure understanding of the difficult things that we have in life, but that's where our faith can grow, because we know God He's fulfilling this awesome story, this rescue plan that He's doing. And that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand more clearly what it is that God is doing. Do you think we will fully understand Him completely? There's just no way. There's just no way. We're not ever going to wrap our minds around the complexity of God and all the stuff that He's working out through the universe for us. We're just not ever going to be there. We're not going to have all the answers. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to question. That's part of our journey. I think that's part of what we ought to do. Question and ponder and wonder about the things of God, because that's how He made us. He created us in that, to keep seeking Him out. I can imagine that during the time of these people would have been in the middle of all that they've been through, the wandering for 40 years, and now they're at the brink of taking over this land. I'm sure there was people there that had question regarding what God was doing. I think we have questions today. Obviously, as we look back on this story, we have questions today. We don't fully understand it. We're not going to. I have questions today about what He is doing with His people today in 2021. I have questions how this rescue plan is being worked out. We have an important vote coming up in this congregation as it relates to what this church is going to look like in a few months, if it's going to stay United Methodist or not. And I have questions about that. And it's forced me, I think, in the last several years to really think about what's God doing in the United Methodist Church? How's he working out His plan in the Methodist Church when it just seems like for the last decades there's this inability for the church to resolve the major issues that just cannot come to grips with? What's He doing? All of this diversity and different thought that we have within the church that's just causing division and conflict. And how does that play out with this church, Pleasant Chapel? I think the whole process, I think, is focused, or forced me at least, going through this, it's caused me to really consider what are my beliefs? What is it that I believe about these things? What is it that I believe about what the church really should be doing? What should Pleasant Chapel be doing? How is it that we both accept and welcome all people, and yet how is it that we hold on to truth? What is He doing in the church right now? Why is there all this bustedness that there seems to be that just hinders the overall mission of the church, is to draw people to Christ and to make disciples of Him? I can't fully understand what He's doing. I have questions, but I believe it's causing me to grow personally. I'm not going to have all the answers, but I think what does trump my understanding, it's my belief. I believe that beyond understanding what God is doing through all this is faith. And I think it's time for me to put more trust in what He's going to do with this church, what He's going to do with the denomination. More importantly, what He's going to do with this congregation. I need to not be so worried about understanding all this and trust that God is so faithful and He's got great plans for what this church can be. Wednesday was Ash Wednesday, and we normally have a service that kicks off Lent. Lent is the time where traditionally Christians take time to prepare for the great event of Easter. Easter's our big one. Easter's our Super Bowl. And we use this time from Ash Wednesday up until Easter morning, where we focus our lives on self-sacrifice and prayer and the reading of Scripture and good works. And that helps us then focus on this awesome sacrifice that God did for you on Good Friday and the victory we all get to participate on resurrection morning of Easter. And I guess I would like to challenge our congregation to take this time through Lent. We'll go retroactive to Wednesday if that's okay, since we didn't get to meet. That we would focus our attention on being prayerful about what's happening with this church and what it is the direction God would have for this church. Palm Sunday would be the week right before Easter, and that Palm Sunday is the day of our vote. That's the day that we will have our church conference to come. And I think this is I think it's appropriate for us, and I'd like to challenge us to just be in prayer about what it is that God is having this church do. Should we vote to disaffiliate? Should we vote to stay within this denomination? I believe ought to be a God thing that is sought out because you have been prayerful about this and you've been in discussion with each other. I strongly encourage that. Talk with one another about what this means. Read what this means about what this would mean for our church. I don't get a vote. I'm not a member. It's up to y'all. You're the voting members, and you'll have this decision in a few weeks that's coming. And I want to go back to this fundamental question that I believe needs to be answered as you consider this. Because regardless of all of the factors that seem to come into play here regarding this vote, there's a lot of things. Well, it's clearly about an issue that the church cannot come to an understanding on human sexuality. That's a big part of this. That's where we're at. Another big part of this is, us staying within the denomination or us being able to get our stuff back. That's a factor. We can get our deed back and we can get legal ownership to the assets that this church has. Currently, it's being held by the district. Another factor is, if you're not part of the Methodist Church, then you've got to decide who fills your pulpit. You have never had to work on that before. That's something that would change if you weren't part of the denomination. If we stayed within the denomination, what would that mean in regards to us being a good, strong Methodist church and becoming more fully involved in the networking of the church? Those are all factors, but I don't believe it's the fundamental question that you need to be thinking about. The one I believe you need to be praying about is, which way would I vote that would cause this church to be the best possible church it could be in this community? How could Pleasant Chapel be the best possible church? Is it to remain in the denomination, or is it to disaffiliate from the denomination? That's the fundamental question I believe that needs to be asked. And it's a loaded question. Because in that question you need to, what does a good church look like? What would a thriving, awesome Pleasant Chapel look like? And that needs to be dreamed up. That needs to be imagined in your mind, that you think about what this church ought to be doing in this community. And how is it that we proclaim Christ the best way we can as a church in the community of Roanoke and in the communities of Huntington? That is the fundamental question that I believe needs to be answered. And it's loaded because that forces us to think deeply about what this church really ought to be doing. What is it a good church should be doing? And what would that look like? And once I have thought through that and prayed through that, then I think your vote will be clear. And I'm going to trust what that vote is. Let's stand and we'll close with prayer. Great God, we just praise your name. We praise you for this preservation of your story. We thank you that we can revisit this story, but more than that, we thank you that we are allowed to participate in this story. Lord, allow us to be just great players as your story continues. Allow this congregation to come together as one and to be an awesome beacon, a place that this community would recognize and know that you are here. And when that happens, we give you all the praise and glory. Amen. Have a great week and stay warm.